Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, the second place vote among our patrons and our members for what should be the next reaction was the Anglo-Saxon Kings Family Tree by our friend Matt over at Useful Charts. It is one of my favorite channels on YouTube because it combines two of my loves, history and genealogy, in one. Speaking of genealogy, I am going to get to my friend Jarrett Ross at some point and do some of the Gene-vlogger videos. But I wanted to dive into this one. It also combines my love of the British history. This is a little bit earlier than kind of my wheelhouse of British medieval monarchy history. This goes back to the time before England existed. So I'm expecting to learn some things I did not know. I'll know about some of these people. But especially since I'm heading to the UK in just a few days, I'm excited. Actually, by the time you guys are watching this, I'll be on my way there. So here we go. Let's go ahead and dive in. As always, the link is in the description to the original content.
Hi, this is Jasmine from the YouTube channel a long time ago. Today I'll be guest narrating for Useful Charts in order to show you the family tree of the Anglo-Saxon monarchs. In Matt's video on the British monarchy, he started with Alfred the Great and then traced the line all the way back down to Queen Elizabeth II. But we can actually trace the royal line several hundred years further back. You see, prior to the emergence of the Kingdom of England, Alfred's ancestors ruled over a kingdom known as the Kingdom of Wessex. Wessex was just one of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
And if you notice some of these names, they may mention it, but Sussex, Wessex, Essex, those all come from the fact that they were Saxon kingdoms. It's South Saxe, Saxa, S-A-X-E, I guess it is. West Saxons, the East Saxons. There's no Nosex, because I believe that's actually, I want to say that was Norfolk was the area that would have been North Saxon. But yeah, these come from the Saxons, which you have the Angles and the Saxons, which make the Anglo-Saxon, kind of settling the southern part of England. The Britons were the ones who were already there, along with Celts. The northern part of what we know as England is going to be settled a lot by what we're sometimes known as the Danes, Viking incursions, things like that. But I'm sure we'll talk about all of it.
Existed in England prior to, well, England. So today I'm going to show you the family tree of some of the most important monarchs who ruled during the Anglo-Saxon period.
Great intro, by the way. I always love this intro.
Let's start with some background.
Oh, good.
From 43 to 410 CE, the area now known as England was a province of the Roman Empire called Britannia.
Yeah, it was Julius Caesar who invades Britannia at one point. Doesn't get real far, but the Romans do eventually continue to push. 43, so we're talking a good almost 100 years after Julius Caesar's time before they really conquer this area.
And it was mostly inhabited by a group of Celtic people known as the Britons. However, in the year 406, things started to change. In that year, Germanic armies crossed the Rhine River for the first time and started to take over the Western Roman Empire. By the year 410, the Romans were no longer able to keep troops in Britain and therefore abandoned the province. Sometime after this, Germanic tribes started to invade the shores of Great Britain, although there is evidence that some Germanic peoples arrived before this time as well. These Germanic invaders came from 3 main tribes: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. It is from the Angles and the Saxons that we get the term Anglo-Saxon, and from the Angles that we get the word English. Over time,
Yeah, it was Angloland originally, and that just kind of, like a lot of things, eventually became England.
Process of migration and assimilation, the language and culture of the area went from being primarily Brittonic to being primarily Anglo-Saxon, with many Britons being pushed into what is today Wales. Eventually, 7 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms emerged: the Anglic kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia and East Anglia, the Saxon kingdoms of Wessex, Essex and Sussex, meaning West Saxons, East Saxons and South Saxons, and the Jutish kingdom of Kent. This is why this period is also sometimes called the Heptarchy, meaning the 7 kings. In reality,
the 7 kingdoms. Game of Thrones fans?
In reality, though, there was never a time in which all 7 kingdoms were equally strong.
Yeah.
For example, throughout much of the Anglo-Saxon period, Mercia was the dominant power, and then eventually it was Wessex. Okay, let's now return to the family tree.
I'm really glad they did all of that, because to understand all of this, it's really important to understand how that all fits in. And if you want to see a somewhat fictionalized but based in reality series on this, obviously Vikings is one, but my favorite one is the Last Kingdom, which covers a lot of the people we're going to talk about in this.
At the top you can see the names of the 7 kings who were credited with having established the royal lines associated with each of the 7 kingdoms. On this chart, yellow represents the 3 Anglic kingdoms, red the 3 Saxon kingdoms, and purple the single Jutish kingdom. However, please note that the coats of arms you see above each line did not actually exist at the time. Heraldry wasn't really a thing until 600 years later, during the High Middle Ages. So each of the shields you see here are simply later inventions that were attributed back to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
And that's true in a lot of history. There are a lot of things that we use to describe time periods and people that were not used at the time in contemporary writings. Perfect example of this would be how we talk about the dynasty of the Plantagenets. They did not call themselves Plantagenets. We use that to refer to that period in time, that 300 or so years that dynasty ruled England. They would have considered themselves the Angevins because they came from Anjou originally. So we do a lot of that kind of retroactive applying names and heraldry and things like that.
Long after they were gone. Another later invention that was attributed back to the early Anglo-Saxon kings was the title of Bretwalda, which literally means Britain ruler, and which was kind of a similar title to that of High King. Although the title probably didn't exist initially, later chronicles assigned it to the various Anglo-Saxon kings, who were thought to have been the dominant ones. So, for example, the first 4 Bretwalders were said to have been Alla of Sussex, Cheolin of Wessex, Athelbert of Kent, and Radwald of East Anglia. King Athelbert of Kent is notable in that he was the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity.
And you know, what's interesting about all this is we talk about this time being the Dark Ages, right? But there are incredibly rich, detailed accounts that we have of some of these people and of this era that were written down by people either at the time or soon after. And that survived. Now, there's not a ton of those accounts, but we do have them, and it's really quite incredible that we are able to know so much about these people.
This was largely due to the fact that he married a Merovingian princess, the woman now known as Saint Berta.
The Merovingians being, now we're talking about the lines that deal with the family of Charlemagne.
However, his actual conversion is credited to Saint Augustine of Canterbury, not to be confused with the more famous Saint Augustine of Hippo. Note that the current leader of the Church of England is known as the Archbishop of Canterbury, a title that traces its origins back to the Augustine who converted Athelbert. Athelbert was also supposedly a direct descendant of Hengist, Hengist and Horsa being the 2 legendary brothers who were said to have led the initial Anglo-Saxon invasion. For the remainder of this video, we are going to focus on the 3 largest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria. Let's start with Northumbria. Northumbria was originally 2 kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira. However, Bernicia and Deira eventually merged due to a rather messy sequence of events. To explain, let's start around the year 600, which happens to be around the time that King Athelbert of Kent became the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity. Around this time, the king of Bernicia was a man named Athelthryth, and the king of Deira was a man named Athelric. The exact details are unclear, but it seems that Athelthryth eventually conquered Deira, perhaps killing Athelric in the process. This led to Athelric's brother Edwin being exiled, where he eventually wound up in the court of King Radwald of East Anglia. Athelthryth thus became the first king of both Bernicia and Deira. However, after about a decade of ruling over both kingdoms, Athelthryth was attacked by the armies of Radwald. Radwald killed Athelthryth and placed his ally Edwin on the throne instead, thus making Edwin the second king to rule both Bernicia and Deira. Around the same time, King Athelbert of Kent died, leaving Radwald as the most powerful king, and hence the new Bretwalda. I should also point out that Radwald is thought to have been the owner of the Sutton Hoo helmet,
Oh,
an ornately
yeah.
decorated helmet found in a ship grave during an archaeological excavation in
Sutton Hoo, there's a movie they made about that discovery. It's one of the most incredible archaeological discoveries in history, and it happened fairly recently, like in the last several decades in England. And it's just this incredible treasure trove of information that opened up so much. You know, there are times in history, things like finding the Rosetta Stone, where history completely, or our understanding of history completely changes overnight because of a discovery, and this is one of those events.
1939. Anyway, Edwin eventually married the daughter of Athlebold of Kent, and as a result, he too converted to Christianity. When Radwold died, Edwin became the 5th Bretwalder, but fighting continued between the kingdoms, and eventually Edwin was killed by King Penda of Mercia, who had allied with the Welsh king Cadwallon. At this point, Bernicia and Deira were once again split into 2 kingdoms, with Edwin's kinsman Osric taking Deira. And
that's one of the important things they already mentioned that we have to keep in mind with all this stuff, is that at any given time, there's a lot of ebb and flow and a lot of changes to the borders of these countries. And there's a lot of times when one of these kingdoms comes under the sway of another, and marriages unite folks, and it's just like the wider European picture, but on a smaller scale in what we know today as England. It's like a mini version of that, with all of these intermarriages and alliances and conquests, and then occasionally you get people from overseas who come in, like the Danes, and kind of mix it all up and throw everything out of whack.
And Athelthryth's son, Eanthryth, taking Bernicia. Note that Athelthryth had actually married Edwin's sister, Atcha, and thus Eanthryth was Edwin's nephew. However, the Welsh king Cadwallon continued to attack Bernicia and Deira, and eventually managed to kill both Osric and Eanthryth. Later chroniclers would blame this on the fact that both Osric and Eanthryth had reverted their lands back to paganism. The stage was thus set for the 6th Bretwalder, Eanthryth's brother Oswald. During Edwin's reign, both Eanthryth and Oswald had been exiled to Scotland, where they converted to Christianity. But unlike Eanthryth, who dropped his new faith upon becoming king, Oswald remained Christian. According to legend, he stuck a large wooden cross in the ground before a battle against Cadwallon, and for this reason was able to win back both Bernicia and Deira. Whether or not this is actually true, what is true is that during his reign, Christianity became firmly entrenched in England. After his death, Bernicia and Deira were split for one final time. Oswin, son of Osric, took Deira, and Oswe, brother of Oswald, took Bernicia. But eventually Oswe had Oswin killed and managed to take hold of Deira. Thus, in the year 654, Bernicia and Deira were formally merged to create the Kingdom of Northumbria.
Which is huge, because Northumbria is going to be one of the power players for the next several hundred years.
The rule of Oswe. In order to cement the deal, Oswe married Eanflad, the daughter of Saint Edwin. Thus, Oswe became the 7th and final Bretwalder. However, the main thing Oswe is remembered for is defeating Penda, king of Mercia, at the Battle of Wynwad. Penda was the last major pagan king to rule over an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and his death at the Battle of Wynwad is seen as the end of pre-Christian England. Oswe was followed by Edgebert, a son of Eanflad, and then by Aldfrith, a son by his second wife, Finn, who was an Irish princess. Aldfrith married Cuthber, sister of King Ina of Wessex, and together with her had Osred, and possibly Osric. Osric was the last king from the main line of Northumbrian kings. After his death, the throne passed to various, more distant relatives, starting with Ceolwulf. It was in Northumbria during the reign of Ceolwulf that the famous monk known as the Venerable Bede lived. Bede's many writings are arguably the most important sources for the Anglo-Saxon period.
Yeah, Bede is the guy I was thinking of earlier when I talked about how we have these writings that are pretty close to when they happened, and that's one of the important things you look for when you're looking at how accurate something is. How close to the actual events is this person writing? So in other words, are they writing just stuff that they've heard and gathered on their own and tried to research, or have they actually talked to the people who were involved or witnessed these things firsthand?
In fact, he is considered to be one of the most important historians from early Christian Europe.
Absolutely.
Okay, at this point, let's turn our attention to the Kingdom of Mercia, which was located just below Northumbria. The word Mercia comes from the word march, which at the time simply meant the borderlands.
So you'll hear that term all the way into the medieval period, where they talk about the Welsh Marches. That would be that border area in western England between England and Wales.
In Mercia's case, the name likely referred to the border between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons. So initially its rulers were simply the leaders of the border folk, but eventually...
And another thing you'll often hear is you'll hear references to marcher lords, which are the very, very important members of the nobility whose job it was to guard those borders. And so that's why, for example, during the Kingdom of England, you have like the Percys, who are super important marcher lords up in the north on the border with Scotland. And it's actually going to be one of the Percys, who we know as Hotspur. Yes, the football team in London, Tottenham Hotspur, is named after him.
Eventually the area evolved into a kingdom that was officially known as Mercia. Their line starts with a man named Ichel, who, unlike all other Anglo-Saxon kings, actually had royal roots back on the continent. He is said to have been the son of the last Anglic king of Germany. However, please keep in mind that the early genealogy for all of these families is a bit sketchy, and therefore should be taken with a grain of salt. For example, most of the Anglo-Saxon genealogies list all of these kings as going all the way back to the god Woden, who is known in Norse mythology as Odin. The first really powerful king of Mercia was Penda, who I've already mentioned as being the last major pagan king from any of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
So 655 is what you're looking at. So you're looking at a period of about 200 years of the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes being in what we know today as England before all of those kingdoms, at least their rulers, have converted to Christianity. And basically whatever your ruler was, that was what you were expected to be too. That doesn't mean that there weren't pagan religions existing, but by this point these kingdoms are certainly considered to be Christian.
However, after Penda's death, his sons converted to Christianity. Peada was the first to rule, but he did so as a subordinate to Oswe of Northumbria. He was murdered in less than a year, making his brother Wulfhere the next king. Wulfhere managed to gain back control of Mercia from Northumbria, and it was during his reign that Mercia replaced Northumbria as the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Wulfhere was followed by his brother Athelred, and then by his son Coenred, and then by Athelred's son Coelred. We then get to Athlebold, a descendant of Penda's brother. Athlebold reigned for 41 years, which is the longest verifiable reign for any Anglo-Saxon king. He was the dominant king when Bede was writing. However, Bede did not give him the title of Brett Welder, presumably because Bede was writing to explain the past, not the present. Athelbold would likely have reigned even longer. However, he was assassinated, resulting in a brief civil war, which was won by a relative of his named Offa. Offa of Mercia is generally seen as being the greatest of all the Anglo-Saxon kings prior to Alfred the Great. Some even consider him to be a precursor to the later kings of unified England. His reign coincided with the reign of another great king over on the continent, that of Charlemagne. In fact, the two corresponded several times on matters of diplomacy. At one point, it seemed that Charlemagne's heir would marry one of Offa's daughters. However, that didn't end up happening. Offa is also remembered for building Offa's Dyke, an 8-foot-high mound of earth that stretched 177 miles from the top of Wales all the way to the bottom, and to this day still roughly marks the border between England and Wales. After a nice long reign of 39 years, Offa was succeeded by his son Edgebert, and then by a distant relative named Coenwulf. However, in the decades that followed, Mercia started to decline, and Wessex would soon replace it as the dominant power. So let's turn our attention to Wessex.
And one of the problems that Mercia has to deal with is, if you look at the map, they're right in the middle of everything, right? They've got the... in fact, I want to go back and look at that map so I can show you what I'm talking about. So take a look right here. Look where Mercia is. They've got what becomes Wales to the west. They've got Northumbria in the north. They've got East Anglia, Essex, and Wessex all bordering them. So if you're someone like Wessex, you've got Cornwall down here, just kind of have to deal with them a little bit. And then you've really got Mercia. And then eventually, of course, you're going to have the Danes who kind of take a lot of this territory here. So Mercia is just geographically in a tough spot to where it's going to be difficult for them to stay out of trouble.
As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, The royal line of Wessex is the line from which the current British royals descend. It started with a man named Cerdic. If you, like many people, are able to trace your lineage to one of the early Plantagenet kings of England, then Cerdic is also one of your ancestors,
Grandpa!
And probably the earliest ancestor that you can trace a line to with any certainty. However, keep in mind that during the lifetime of Cerdic, the kingdom of Wessex didn't actually exist yet, and in fact he might not even have considered himself a king. Instead, he was probably simply a tribal leader, his tribe being known as the Yewisse. It was not until the reign of his great-grandson, Cernygils, who was the first in the dynasty to convert to Christianity, that the title King of the West Saxons, or King of Wessex, was used. Cernygils was followed by his son Caernwald. However, early on in the reign of Caernwald, Wessex came under the direct control of Penda of Mercia for a few years. This is why you can see a gap in his regnal dates. Also, some sources indicate that, after his death, his wife Saexbur reigned for about a year. If this was the case, it would be quite notable, as Saexbur would be the only queen to rule in her own right during the entire Anglo-Saxon period. Earlier, Caernwald might also have married a sister of Penda. It is thought that Coenwulf of Mercia and his descendants may have descended from this line. Anyway, after Saexbur, the throne jumped around a bit between several kings whose exact lineage is unknown, before moving to a totally different branch of the family.
And you have to understand that, and I don't fully know this history really well, that there wasn't a strict inheritance system at play here where there was automatically a known inheritance, like, okay, the oldest son of the current king is going to be the new king. This stuff had to be chosen and ratified. Now, it often happened that way, which is why you see the descent of these kings going down through from father to son. But, Alfred, for example, was not the oldest son in his family, and he wasn't very strong either. But so it did jump around a bit for various reasons.
The one that descended from Ceolin, who I mentioned earlier as being the second Bretwalda. The first king from this branch was Cadwalla, and then Inna. During their reigns, Wessex reached its greatest extent up to that point, dominating the kingdoms of Kent, Essex and Sussex. However, after Inna, Wessex came under the influence of Mercia for almost a century during the reigns of Athlebold and Offa, and the throne of Wessex jumped around between several more distant relatives. That all changed with the arrival of Edgebert. Edgebert was the great-great-grandson of Inna's brother, and his father had been appointed sub-king of Kent. Just prior to Edgebert's reign, the throne of Wessex had been held by Beorhtric, a son-in-law, and therefore a likely puppet king of Offa. But Edgebert managed to regain independence for Wessex, setting the stage for Wessex to become the new dominant power. In fact, later chroniclers writing in Wessex listed Edgebert as an 8th Bretwalda, which shows some obvious bias on their part because they skipped over the Mercian kings of Athlebold and Offa, who arguably deserved the title as well. Edgebert was followed by his son Athelwulf, who was in turn followed by 4 of his sons in succession, the last of whom was Alfred the Great.
There you go. Alfred is the 4th brother in that same family to come to the throne, and he is the one and only king that we remember as the Great among the Anglo-Saxon or later Norman and later on the dynasties that followed.
During the reign of the 3rd son, Athelbert, a major event occurred that would eventually lead to the unification of England. That event was the arrival of the Great Heathen Army, a massive coalition of Vikings who launched a major attack along the eastern seaboard of Great Britain. Over the next several years, the Vikings were able to conquer much of Northumbria.
So what do you do when you have, this is like, basically it's the situation here is, all right, brothers, we can fight against each other, but if somebody attacks one of us, well, now they have to take on all of us, right? So outsiders come in, this great heathen, non-Christian army comes in, these pagans. So we better unite, or one by one, we're all going to fall.
Mercia, East Anglia, and Essex. But after Alfred the Great came to the throne, the tide started to shift. In 878, Alfred fought the Viking leader Guthrum in the Battle of Edington, and won.
That is one of the things you see in The Last Kingdom, even if it is a fictionalized version of these events.
At this point, England was basically divided in two, with the Viking-controlled areas becoming known as the Danelaw, and the Anglo-Saxon areas coming under the rule of Alfred. In fact, in 886, Alfred declared himself to be the king of the Anglo-Saxon.
In fact, to this day, a lot of the place names that exist in England, you can see a difference between the ones that were a part of Wessex and the ones that were a part of Danelaw. Now, granted, then you have Norman influence coming in as well when the Norman invasion happens. But to this day, a lot, places like York, for example. York is very close to Jorvik, which was the Danish name for a place that I think for the Romans was a Boricum, and to the Anglo-Saxons, they called it Ephewich.
In fact, in 886, Alfred declared himself to be the king of the Anglo-Saxons. He was followed by his son Edward the Elder, with his son-in-law Athelred, and later his daughter Athelflud, overseeing Mercia. Edward the Elder continued to gain ground against the Vikings, and two of his daughters married the most powerful rulers on the continent, Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks, and Otto the Great, king of the East Franks, who would go on.
And the West and East Franks were the successors to the kingdom that had been ruled by Charlemagne. West Francia is what we roughly today call France, and the East Francians would basically be Germany.
On to become the first real Holy Roman Emperor. Edward the Elder was followed by Athelstan, who in 927 defeated the final Viking stronghold at York, and became the first king of a totally unified England, although at the time his actual title was King of the English. Thus marks the end of our journey. From this point on, the story continues in Matt's video on the British monarch's family tree, which traces the line from Athelstan all the way to Queen Elizabeth II. You can find a link to that video in the description.
And I've done that video, so I'll throw that link up on the screen if you want to continue this journey with my reaction a while back to the British monarch's family tree. You can check that out up there. Highly encourage you to check out useful charts, great stuff. Matt's a good dude. Has a lot of interesting, if you're interested in biblical history and what we know historically about some of the people and places in the Bible. He covers a lot of that stuff. He covers a lot of Muslim history. He covers fictional family trees like from Game of Thrones and things like that. So there's a lot of really cool stuff there. Check it out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.